The Ego and the ID 1923. The present discussions are a further development of some trains of thought which I opened up in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920g, and to which, as I remarked there, my attitude was one of a kind of benevolent curiosity. In the following pages, these thoughts are linked to various facts of analytic observation, and an attempt is made to arrive at new conclusions from this conjunction. In the present work, however, there are no fresh borrowings from biology, and on that account it stands closer to psychoanalysis than does Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It is more in the nature of a synthesis than of a speculation, and seems to have had an ambitious aim in view. I am conscious, however, that it does not go beyond the roughest outline, and with that limitation I am perfectly content. In these pages things are touched on which have not yet been the subject of psychoanalytic consideration, and it has not been possible to avoid trenching upon some theories which have been put forward by non-analysts or by former analysts on their retreat from analysis. I have elsewhere always been ready to acknowledge what I owe to other workers, but in this instance I feel burdened by no such debt of gratitude. If psychoanalysis has not hitherto shown its appreciation of certain things, this has never been because it overlooked their achievement or sought to deny their importance, but because it followed a particular path, which had not yet led so far. And finally, when it has reached them, things have a different look to it from what they have to others. The dependent relationships of the ego. The complexity of our subject matter must be an excuse for the fact that none of the chapter headings of this book quite correspond to their contents, and that in turning to new aspects of the topic we are constantly harking back to matters that have already been dealt with. Thus we have said repeatedly that the ego is formed to a great extent out of identifications which take the place of abandoned cathexes by the ID, that the first of these identifications always behave as a special agency in the ego and stand apart from the ego in the form of a superego, while later on, as it grows stronger, the ego may become more resistant to the influences of such identifications. The superego owes its special position in the ego, or in relation to the ego, to a factor which must be considered from two sides. On the one hand, it was the first identification, and one which took place while the ego was still feeble, and on the other hand, it is the heir to the Oedipus complex, and has thus introduced the most momentous objects into the ego. The superego's relation to the later alterations of the ego is roughly similar to that of the primary sexual phase of childhood to later sexual life after puberty. Although it is accessible to all later influences, it nevertheless preserves throughout life the character given to it by its derivation from the father complex, namely, the capacity to stand apart from the ego and to master it. It is a memorial of the former weakness and dependence of the ego, and the mature ego remains subject to its domination. As the child was once under a compulsion to obey its parents, so the ego submits to the categorical imperative of its superego. But the derivation of the superego from the first object cathexes of the ID, from the Oedipus complex, signifies even more for it. This derivation, as we have already shown, brings it into relation with the phylogenetic acquisitions of the ID and makes it a reincarnation of former ego structures which have left their precipitates behind in the ID. Thus the superego is always close to the ID and can act as its representative vis-a-vis the ego. It reaches deep down into the ID, and for that reason is farther from consciousness than the ego is. We shall best appreciate these relations by turning to certain clinical facts, which have long since lost their novelty, but which still await theoretical discussion. There are certain people who behave in a quite peculiar fashion during the work of analysis. When one speaks hopefully to them or expresses satisfaction with the progress of the treatment, they show signs of discontent, and their condition invariably becomes worse. One begins by regarding this as defiance and as an attempt to prove their superiority to the physician, but later one comes to take a deeper and juster view. One becomes convinced not only that such people cannot endure any praise or appreciation, but that they react inversely to the progress of the treatment. Every partial solution that ought to result, and in other people does result, in an improvement or a temporary suspension of symptoms produces in them 427. Free ebook at www.sigmunfreud.net. The time being an exacerbation of their illness, they get worse during the treatment instead of getting better. They exhibit what is known as a negative therapeutic reaction. There is no doubt that there is something in these people that sets itself against their recovery, and its approach is dreaded as though it were a danger. We are accustomed to say that the need for illness has got the upper hand in them over the desire for recovery. If we analyze this resistance in the usual way, then, even after allowance has been made for an attitude of defiance towards the physician and for fixation to the various forms of gain from illness, the greater part of it is still left over, and this reveals itself as the most powerful of all obstacles to recovery, more powerful than the familiar ones of narcissistic inaccessibility, a negative attitude towards the physician and clinging to the gain from illness. In the end, we come to see that we are dealing with what may be called a moral factor, a sense of guilt, which is finding its satisfaction in the illness and refuses to give up the punishment of suffering. We shall be right in regarding this disheartening explanation as final. But as far as the patient is concerned, this sense of guilt is dumb. It does not tell him he is guilty. He does not feel guilty. He feels ill. This sense of guilt expresses itself only as a resistance to recovery, which it is extremely difficult to overcome. It is also particularly difficult to convince the patient that this motive lies behind his continuing to be ill. He holds fast to the more obvious explanation that treatment by analysis is not the right remedy for his case. The description we have given applies to the most extreme instances of this state of affairs, but in a lesser measure this factor has to be reckoned with in very many cases, perhaps in all comparatively severe cases of neurosis. In fact, it may be precisely this element in the situation, the attitude of the ego ideal, that determines the severity of a neurotic illness. We shall not hesitate, therefore, to discuss rather more fully the way in which the sense of guilt expresses itself under different conditions. The battle with the obstacle of an unconscious sense of guilt is not made easy for the analyst. Nothing can be done against it directly and nothing indirectly, but the slow procedure of but otherwise the outcome of one's efforts is by no means certain. It depends principally on the intensity of the sense of guilt. There is often no counteracting force of a similar order of strength which the treatment can oppose to it. Perhaps it may depend, too, on whether the personality of the analyst allows of the patient's putting him in the place of his ego ideal, and this involves a temptation for the analyst to play the part of prophet, savior, and redeemer to the patient. Since the rules of analysis are diametrically opposed to the physician's making use of his personality in any such manner, it must be honestly confessed that here we have another limitation to the effectiveness of analysis. After all, analysis does not set out to make pathological reactions impossible, but to give the patient's ego freedom to decide one way or the other. An interpretation of the normal, conscious sense of guilt, conscience, presents no difficulties. It is based on the tension between the ego and the ego ideal and is the expression of a condemnation of the ego by its critical agency. The feelings of inferiority so well known in neurotics are presumably not far removed from it. In two very familiar maladies, the sense of guilt is overstrongly conscious. In them, the ego ideal displays particular severity and often rages against the ego in a cruel fashion. The attitude of the ego ideal in these two conditions, obsessional neurosis and melancholia, presents, alongside of this similarity, differences that are no less significant. In certain forms of obsessional neurosis, the sense of guilt is overnoisy, but cannot justify itself to the ego. Consequently, the patient's ego rebels against the imputation of guilt and seeks the physician's support in repudiating it. It would be folly to acquiesce in this, for to do so would have no effect. Analysis eventually shows that the superego is being influenced by processes that have remained unknown to the ego. It is possible to discover the repressed impulses which are really at the bottom of the sense of guilt. Thus, in this case, the superego knew more than the ego about the unconscious ID. In melancholia, the impression that the superego has obtained a hold upon consciousness is even stronger. But here the ego ventures no objection. It admits its guilt and submits to the punishment. We understand the difference. In obsessional neurosis, what were in question were objectionable impulses which remained outside the ego, while in melancholic the object to which the superego's wrath applies has been taken into the ego, through identification. It is certainly not clear why the sense of guilt reaches such an extraordinary strength in these two neurotic disorders, but the main problem presented in this state of affairs lies in another direction. We shall postpone discussion of it until we have dealt with the other cases in which the sense of guilt remains unconscious. It is essentially in hysteria, and in states of a hysterical type, that this is found. Here the mechanism by which the sense of guilt remains unconscious is easy to discover. The hysterical ego fends off a distressing perception with which the criticisms of its superego threaten it, in the same way in which it is in the habit of fending off an unendurable object cathexis by an act of repression. It is the ego, therefore, that is responsible for the sense of guilt remaining unconscious. We know that as a rule the ego carries out repressions in the service and at the behest of its superego, but this is a case in which it has turned the same weapon against its harsh taskmaster. In obsessional neurosis, as we know, the phenomena of reaction formation predominate, but here the ego succeeds only in keeping at a distance the material to which the sense of guilt refers. One may go further and venture the hypothesis that a great part of the sense of guilt must normally remain unconscious because the origin of conscience is intimately connected with the Oedipus complex, which belongs to the unconscious. If anyone were inclined to put forward the paradoxical proposition that the normal man is not only far more immoral than he believes, but also far more moral than he knows, psychoanalysis, on whose findings the first half of the assertion rests, would have no objection to raise against the second half. It was a surprise to find that an increase in this UCS sense of guilt can turn people into criminals, but it is undoubtedly a fact. In many criminals, especially youthful ones, it is possible to detect a very powerful sense of guilt which existed before the crime, and is therefore not its result, but its motive. It is as if it was a relief to be able to fasten this unconscious sense of guilt on to something real and immediate. In all these situations, the superego displays its independence of the conscious ego and its intimate relations with the unconscious ID. Having regard, now, to the importance we have ascribed to preconscious verbal residues in the ego, the question arises whether it can be the case that the superego, in so far as it is UCS, consists in such word presentations, and if it does not, what else it consists in. Our tentative answer will be that it is as impossible for the superego as for the ego to disclaim its origin from things heard, for it is a part of the ego and remains accessible to consciousness by way of these word presentations, concepts, abstractions. But the catechtic energy does not reach these contents of the superego from auditory perception, instruction, or reading, but from sources in the ID. This proposition is only apparently a paradox. It simply states that human nature has a far greater extent, both for good and for evil, than it thinks it has, i.e. than its ego is aware of through conscious perception. The question which we put off answering runs as follows. How is it that the superego manifests itself essentially as a sense of guilt, or rather as criticism, for the sense of guilt is the perception in the ego answering to this criticism, and moreover develops such extraordinary harshness and severity towards the ego? If we turn to melancholia first, we find that the excessively strong superego which has obtained a hold upon consciousness rages against the ego with merciless violence, as if it had taken possession of the whole of the sadism available in the person concerned. Following our view of sadism, we should say that the destructive component had entrenched itself in the superego and turned against the ego. What is now holding sway in the superego is, as it were, a pure culture of the death instinct, and in fact it often enough succeeds in driving the ego into death, if the latter does not fend off its tyrant in time by the change round into mania. The reproaches of conscience in certain forms of obsessional neurosis are as distressing and tormenting, but here the situation is less perspicuous. It is noteworthy that the obsessional neurotic, in contrast to the melancholic, never in fact takes the step of self-destruction. It is as though he were immune against the danger of suicide, and he is far better protected from it than the hysteric. We can see that what guarantees the safety of the ego is the fact that the object has been retained. In obsessional neurosis, it has become possible, through a regression to the pregenital organization, for the love impulses to transform themselves into impulses of aggression against the object. Here again the instinct of destruction has been set free, and it seeks to destroy the object, or at least it appears to have that intention. These purposes have not been adopted by the ego, and it struggles against them with reaction formations and precautionary measures. They remain in the ID. The superego, however, behaves as if the ego were responsible for them, and shows at the same time by the seriousness with which it chastises these destructive intentions that they are no mere semblance evoked by regression, but an actual substitution of hate for love. Helpless in both directions, The ego defends itself vainly, alike against the instigations of the murderous ID and against the reproaches of the punishing conscience. It succeeds in holding in check at least the most brutal actions of both sides. The first outcome is interminable self-torment, and eventually there follows a systematic torturing of the object, insofar as it is within reach. The dangerous death instincts are dealt with in the individual in various ways. In part, they are rendered harmless by being fused with erotic components. In part, they are diverted towards the external world in the form of aggression, while to a large extent they undoubtedly continue their internal work unhindered. How is it then that in melancholia the superego can become a kind of gathering place for the death instincts? From the point of view of instinctual control, of morality, it may be said of the ID that it is totally non-moral, of the ego that it strives to be moral, and of the superego that it can be supermoral and then become as cruel as only the ID can be. It is remarkable that the more a man checks his aggressiveness towards the exterior, the more severe, that is aggressive, he becomes in his ego ideal. The ordinary view sees the situation the other way round. The standard set up by the ego ideal seems to be the motive for the suppression of aggressiveness. The fact remains, however, as we have stated it, the more a man controls his aggressiveness, the more intense becomes his ideal's inclination to aggressiveness against his ego. It is like a displacement, a turning round upon his own ego. But even ordinary normal morality has a harshly restraining, cruelly prohibiting quality. It is from this, indeed, that the conception arises of a higher being who deals out punishment inexorably. I cannot go further in my consideration of these questions without introducing a fresh hypothesis. The superego arises, as we know, from an identification with the father taken as a model. Every such identification is in the nature of a desexualization or even of a sublimation. It now seems as though when a transformation of this kind takes place, an instinctual diffusion occurs at the same time. After sublimation, the erotic component no longer has the power to bind the whole of the destructiveness that was combined with it, and this is released in the form of an inclination to aggression and destruction. This diffusion would be the source of the general character of harshness and cruelty exhibited by the ideal, its dictatorial thou shalt. Let us again consider obsessional neurosis for a moment. The state of affairs is different here. The diffusion of love into aggressiveness has not been affected by the work of the ego, but is the result of a regression which has come about in the ID. But this process has extended beyond the ID to the superego, which now increases its severity towards the innocent ego. It would seem, however, that in this case no less than in that of melancholia, the ego, having gained control over the libido by means of identification, is punished for doing so by the superego through the instrumentality of the aggressiveness which was mixed with the libido. Our ideas about the ego are beginning to clear, and its various relationships are gaining distinctness. We now see the ego in its strength and in its weaknesses. It is entrusted with important functions. By virtue of its relation to the perceptual system, it gives mental processes an order in time and submits them to reality testing. By interposing the processes of thinking, it secures a postponement of motor discharges and controls the access to motility. This last power is, to be sure, a question more of form than of fact. In the matter of action, the ego's position is like that of a constitutional monarch, without whose sanction no law can be passed, but who hesitates long before imposing his veto on any measure put forward by Parliament. All the experiences of life that originate from without enrich the ego. The ID, however, is its second external world, which it strives to bring into subjection to itself. It withdraws libido from the ID and transforms the object cathexes of the ID into ego structures. With the aid of the superego, in a manner that is still obscure to us, it draws upon the experiences of past ages stored in the ID. There are two paths by which the contents of the ID can penetrate into the ego. The one is direct, the other leads by way of the ego ideal. Which of these two paths they take may, for some mental activities, be of decisive importance. The ego develops from perceiving instincts to controlling them, from obeying instincts to inhibiting them. In this achievement, a large share is taken by the ego ideal, which indeed is partly a reaction formation against the instinctual processes of the ID. Psychoanalysis is an instrument to enable the ego to achieve a progressive conquest of the ID. From the other point of view, however, we see this same ego as a poor creature owing service to three masters and consequently menaced by three dangers from the external world, from the libido of the ID, and from the severity of the superego. Three kinds of anxiety correspond to these three dangers, since anxiety is the expression of a retreat from danger. As a frontier creature, the ego tries to mediate between the world and the ID, to make the ID pliable to the world, and, by means of its muscular activity, to make the world fall in with the wishes of the ID. In point of fact, it behaves like the physician during an analytic treatment. It offers itself, with the attention it pays to the real world, as a libidinal object to the ID, and aims at attaching the ID's libido to itself. It is not only a helper to the ID, it is also a submissive slave who courts his master's love. Whenever possible, it tries to remain on good terms with the ID. It clothes the ID's UCS commands with its PCS rationalizations. It pretends that the ID is showing obedience to the admonitions of reality, even when in fact it is remaining obstinate and unyielding. It disguises the ID's conflicts with reality and, if possible, its conflicts with the superego too. In its position midway between the ID and reality, it only too often yields to the temptation to become sycophantic, opportunist, and lying, like a politician who sees the truth but wants to keep his place in popular favor. Towards the two classes of instincts, the ego's attitude is not impartial. Through its work of identification and sublimation, it gives the death instincts in the ID assistance in gaining control over the libido, but in so doing it runs the risk of becoming the object of the death instincts and of itself perishing. In order to be able to help in this way, it has had itself to become filled with libido. It thus itself becomes the representative of eros and henceforward desires to live and to be loved. But since the ego's work of sublimation results in a diffusion of the instincts and a liberation of the aggressive instincts in the superego, its struggle against the libido exposes it to the danger of maltreatment and death. In suffering under the attacks of the superego, or perhaps even succumbing to them, the ego is meeting with a fate like that of the protista, which are destroyed by the products of decomposition that they themselves have created. From the economic point of view, the morality that functions in the superego seems to be a similar product of decomposition. Among the dependent relationships in which the ego stands, that to the superego is perhaps the most interesting. The ego is the actual seat of anxiety. Threatened by dangers from three directions, it develops the flight reflex by withdrawing its own cathexis from the menacing perception or from the similarly regarded process in the ID, and emitting it as anxiety. This primitive reaction is later replaced by the carrying out of protective cathexes, the mechanism of the phobias. What it is that the ego fears from the external and from the libidinal danger cannot be specified. We know that the fear is of being overwhelmed or annihilated, but it cannot be grasped analytically. The ego is simply obeying the warning of the pleasure principle. On the other hand, we can tell what is hidden behind the ego's dread of the superego, the fear of conscience. The superior being, which turned into the ego ideal, once threatened castration, and this dread of castration is probably the nucleus round which the subsequent fear of conscience has gathered. It is this dread that persists as the fear of conscience. The high-sounding phrase, "every fear is ultimately the fear of death," has hardly any meaning and at any rate cannot be justified. It seems to me, on the contrary, perfectly correct to distinguish the fear of death from dread of an object, realistic anxiety, and from neurotic libidinal anxiety. It presents a difficult problem to psychoanalysis, for death is an abstract concept with a negative content for which no unconscious correlative can be found. It would seem that the mechanism of the fear of death can only be that the ego relinquishes its narcissistic libidinal cathexis in a very large measure, that is, that it gives up itself, just as it gives up some external object in other cases in which it feels anxiety. I believe that the fear of death is something that occurs between the ego and the superego. We know that the fear of death makes its appearance under two conditions which, moreover, are entirely analogous to situations in which other kinds of anxiety develop, namely, as a reaction to an external danger and as an internal process, as for instance in melancholia. Once again, a neurotic manifestation may help us to understand a normal one. The fear of death in melancholia only admits of one explanation. that the ego gives itself up because it feels itself hated and persecuted by the superego instead of loved. To the ego, therefore, living means the same as being loved by the superego, which here again appears as the representative of the ID. The superego fulfills the same function of protecting and saving that was fulfilled in earlier days by the father and later by providence or destiny. But when the ego finds itself in an excessive real danger which it believes itself unable to overcome by its own strength, it is bound to draw the same conclusion. It sees itself deserted by all protecting forces and lets itself die. Here, moreover, is once again the same situation as that which underlay the first great anxiety state of birth and the infantile anxiety of longing, the anxiety due to separation from the protecting mother. These considerations make it possible to regard the fear of death, like the fear of conscience, as a development of the fear of castration. The great significance which the sense of guilt has in the neuroses makes it conceivable that common neurotic anxiety is reinforced in severe cases by the generating of anxiety between the ego and the superego, fear of castration, of conscience, of death. The ID, to which we finally come back, has no means of showing the ego either love or hate. It cannot say what it wants. It has achieved no unified will. Eros and the death instinct struggle within it. We have seen with what weapons the one group of instincts defends itself against the other. It would be possible to picture the ID as under the domination of the mute but powerful death instincts, which desire to be at peace and, prompted by the pleasure principle, to put Eros, the mischief maker, to rest. But perhaps that might be to undervalue the part played by Eros.